Intro. He thought control made him powerful, until one woman showed him that peace was stronger than pride. Before we begin, if stories about quiet love, loss, and redemption move something in you, then subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast, where every story reminds you, healing doesn't always come from winning, sometimes it comes from breaking. He was the kind of man who measured life in results, not feelings. Every decision, every word, every moment had to make sense, fit the plan, move him forward. Adrian Cole didn't believe in softness. He believed in strength, in strategy, in silence. But deep down, he was tired. Tired of pretending he didn't care. Tired of walking through rooms filled with noise, and still feeling utterly alone. The world had taught him that emotions were weaknesses, that empathy was naive, and innocence was a mask for ignorance. So, when Evelyn Hart walked into his office one autumn morning, with calm eyes and a voice that carried no armor, he didn't see her as light. He saw her as a liability. She smiled when she spoke, listened when others shouted, and never once tried to prove she was right. To a man like Adrian, that made no sense. He mistook her gentleness for fragility, and her peace for passivity. But what he didn't know was that Evelyn wasn't weak. She was just unafraid to be kind in a world that had forgotten how. And soon, that very courage, the courage to stay soft, would become the one thing strong enough to break him open. Because sometimes, the strongest hearts aren't the ones that conquer, but the ones that forgive, endure, and still choose love. Stay with me. This is the story of Adrian Cole and Evelyn Hart. Of power meeting peace, and pride learning to kneel before grace. You're listening to He Thought Her Innocence Was Weakness, Until It Broke His Heart. 1. The man who feared emotion. Adrian Cole had built his life like a fortress, high walls, clean lines, no open doors. He wasn't born cold, life had taught him to be. The first lesson came young: people leave, promises fade, and feelings only make the fall harder. So he trained himself to feel less, to replace warmth with control. He learned to speak in numbers, not in needs. To measure his worth in results, not in relationships. He was good at it, too good. The world rewarded him for being untouchable, for never flinching, for wearing composure like a crown. He became the man everyone respected, and no one truly knew. There were nights he'd sit alone in his apartment, the city lights flickering against the glass like distant memories, and he'd tell himself this was peace. No arguments, no expectations, no heartbreak. Just quiet, and yet, it was the kind of quiet that echoes. He dated, but never connected. He laughed, but never felt joy. People called him confident. What they didn't see was the fear beneath, the fear of being seen. To Adrian, emotion was a trapdoor. Once you opened it, you couldn't control what fell through. He remembered his father's voice, harsh, certain. Men who show feelings get crushed. And so he built himself into stone. Unbreakable, efficient, impressive. But stone doesn't breathe, and somewhere deep inside, he was suffocating. Still, he told himself it was the price of strength. That caring made you vulnerable. That softness meant surrender. And surrender, to him, was death. Until one day, someone would walk through those walls without force, without noise, and remind him that what he called control was just another word for fear. 2. The girl who never pretended. Evelyn Hart never tried to impress anyone. She didn't chase approval or build masks to be liked. There was something quietly honest about her, the kind of honesty that didn't need to shout to be seen. When she spoke, she looked people in the eye, not to challenge them, but to remind them that kindness was still real. In a world full of noise, she was stillness. While others rushed to prove, to compete, to conquer, Evelyn listened. She listened to understand, not to respond. Her calm wasn't weakness, it was mastery, the kind that came from surviving storms no one else saw. Adrian noticed her first in a meeting. Everyone was talking over each other, throwing numbers and pride like weapons. She sat at the corner of the table, writing notes, saying nothing. Then, when asked her opinion, she simply said, "I think sometimes we forget that we're not fixing numbers, we're helping people." The room went silent. For the first time in years, Adrian didn't have a comeback. He felt something unfamiliar, a strange stillness inside him, like she had spoken to a part of him long buried. He brushed it off, of course. He told himself she was naive, idealistic, a dreamer. But her presence lingered. It was as if every word she said echoed long after she left the room. There was a softness to the way she carried herself, not fragile, but graceful. Even when criticized, she didn't defend herself. She smiled and moved on, as if peace itself was her armor. Evelyn didn't pretend to be strong. Yet somehow, she was the only one in that building who truly was. Because while everyone else fought to appear invincible, she was brave enough to be real. And that, Adrian couldn't understand. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something that would one day undo everything he believed about power. 3. The collision of worlds. Adrian was used to power. He walked into every room expecting to lead, to win, to be obeyed. His words were commands, his silence, even heavier. But Evelyn never played by those rules, because she didn't play any. Their worlds collided, not in chaos, but in contrast. He spoke the language of logic, she, the language of grace. He thrived in control, she lived in acceptance. Every time she disagreed, she didn't argue, she simply asked questions that made him think. And that infuriated him. He remembered one late afternoon when deadlines had everyone tense. A junior employee made a costly mistake, and Adrian snapped, sharp, cold, cutting. Evelyn stepped forward, voice soft but steady. "Sometimes people need space to learn," she said, "not punishment to remember." Her tone wasn't defiant, it was compassionate. And somehow, that stung more than anger. He dismissed her words with a smirk. But they stayed. That night, he replayed them in his head like a melody he didn't want to hear but couldn't silence. Why did her calm feel more powerful than his authority? Why did her gentleness expose something in him that control never could? The next day, she greeted him with the same quiet warmth as always, no bitterness, no pride. It disarmed him completely. He realized he couldn't intimidate her, because she wasn't playing the same game. And for the first time, he began to question the empire he had built, the empire made of walls, precision, and distance. Evelyn didn't challenge him with force. She did it by being everything he couldn't understand. Soft yet strong, kind yet unyielding. And as much as he tried to ignore it, her presence started to rewrite his definition of power. He ruled his world by control. She ruled hers by peace. And now, for the first time, he wasn't sure which world he wanted to live in. 4. The moments that changed him. Change never happens all at once. For Adrian, it came quietly, in moments too small to notice, until they started to matter. It was the way Evelyn stayed late to help a coworker who everyone else ignored. The way she brought coffee for the intern who had just been scolded. The way she smiled at the janitor every morning like he was the most important person in the building. She didn't do it for recognition, she did it because that's who she was. One evening, after everyone had gone home, Adrian walked past her office. The lights were dim, and she was there, rearranging reports on someone else's desk. "Why are you still here?" he asked. She looked up and said softly, "Because kindness isn't part of my job. It's part of me." He didn't know how to respond. No one had ever said something so simple, yet it cut through him like truth always does. He began noticing her more. How she never raised her voice but was always heard. How her calm presence steadied others in a room full of panic. How she could turn tension into silence, and silence into peace. Sometimes, he'd catch himself watching her, wondering how someone could live with that much softness in a world that kept breaking people apart. And each time, a quiet question surfaced in him: when did I stop being like that? There were nights he thought about it longer than he meant to. The reflection in the glass seemed to mock him, a man surrounded by success but starved of sincerity. He realized Evelyn hadn't just entered his life, she had entered the parts of him he'd sealed away. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't know how. But deep inside, something was shifting. It wasn't love yet, it was recognition. Recognition of a truth he had long forgotten, that gentleness isn't the opposite of strength, it's the beginning of it. 5. The night of cruel words. It happened on a Thursday night, the kind that stretches too long. Where exhaustion feels like truth. The office was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the sound of rain against the windows. Evelyn had stayed late again, reviewing a proposal Adrian had torn apart earlier that day. She didn't take it personally, she never did. But he did. When he saw her still there, calm as always, something in him cracked. Her serenity, the thing that once grounded him, suddenly felt like judgment. He mistook her peace for pity. And men like Adrian didn't know how to handle pity. "You don't belong in this world, Evelyn," he said sharply, pacing the room. "You think kindness wins? It doesn't, it gets you crushed." She looked up, eyes steady but sad. "Maybe," she whispered, "but at least kindness doesn't destroy what it touches." The words hit him like a mirror thrown in his face. He wanted to stop, but pride spoke louder than conscience. He laughed, cold, defensive, afraid. "You're naive," he said. "You think purity makes you strong? It just makes you blind." For a moment, silence filled the room, thick and heavy. Evelyn didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply stood, gathered her papers, and looked at him with something he'd never seen before, not anger. Not hurt, but disappointment. And that was worse. Before leaving, she said softly, "I hope one day, you'll see that walls don't protect you, Adrian. They just keep you alone." Then she walked out. No tears, no accusations, just quiet footsteps fading into the sound of rain. He stood there, pulse racing, waiting for the satisfaction that never came. The echo of her voice lingered, hauntingly calm. For the first time, he realized the cruelest words aren't shouted in anger. They're the ones you say to defend your fear. 6. The silence that followed. The next morning, the office felt different, colder, heavier. Her desk was empty, no coffee mug, no faint scent of jasmine, no gentle hum of her voice greeting everyone as they walked in. Evelyn was gone, and with her, something in the air had gone quiet too, a quiet that didn't soothe, but unsettled. Adrian told himself it didn't matter. He buried himself in meetings, numbers, and deadlines. He spoke louder in briefings, laughed harder at jokes, as if volume could drown the emptiness she left behind. But silence has a way of echoing, especially the kind you create yourself. At night, when the city dimmed and his reflection stared back from the glass, he saw the same man, sharp suit, sharp eyes, but now there was something missing. The stillness she once carried had turned into a mirror, and for the first time, he couldn't stand the sight of himself. He caught himself reaching for his phone more than once, typing her name, then erasing it. What would he even say? "I'm sorry?" That wasn't something a man like him said easily. Apologies required vulnerability, and vulnerability was the one language he never learned. Days passed. People moved on. But the space she used to fill didn't. Her absence wasn't loud, it was haunting. Like a song cut off mid-note, leaving the melody unfinished. Sometimes he'd catch traces of her, a phrase someone repeated, a kindness someone mimicked, and for a second, it felt like she was still there. Then it would fade, and he'd be left with the quiet again. He used to think silence was peace. Now he knew better. Silence, when it's the sound of someone missing, is the loudest noise a heart can hear. 7. The days without her. Days blurred together after she left. Meetings, deadlines, numbers, all the same. But somehow emptier. The office still ran like a machine, efficient and relentless, but without Evelyn, it had lost its heartbeat. Adrian noticed things he'd never seen before. The tension in people's shoulders, the way no one looked each other in the eye anymore. The coffee tasted bitterer, the laughter, more forced. Her small acts, the ones he used to overlook, had been holding everything together. He tried to convince himself it was temporary, that she'd come back eventually, that people like her always did. But deep down, he knew Evelyn wasn't the kind to return where she wasn't valued. That realization hit harder than any failure he'd ever known. At night, he'd walk past the cafe she used to stop by after work. He'd see the same corner seat by the window, empty, waiting, like it still remembered her. He did too. He began to understand that her presence hadn't just changed the atmosphere, it had changed him. There were mornings when he caught himself reaching for 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. Old habits, born from quiet moments they shared, small, unspoken rituals that now hurt to remember. He started to replay their conversations, searching for the exact moment he'd pushed too far. Her voice echoed in his mind, soft but unwavering. "Walls don't protect you, Adrian, they just keep you alone." Now, those words didn't sound like an accusation. They sounded like truth, the kind that waits patiently until you're ready to hear it. He had power, success, influence, everything he once believed mattered. But none of it filled the silence she left behind. Because for the first time in his life, Adrian Cole wasn't missing control. He was missing her. 8. The moment of realization. It was late one evening when Adrian found it, a small, worn-out notebook left behind in a forgotten drawer. He recognized the handwriting instantly. Evelyn's. The sight of her looping letters hit him harder than he expected. He sat at his desk, the city glowing behind him, and began to read. The pages were filled with fragments of thoughts, half-finished sentences, little sketches of flowers, and quotes she loved. But one line stopped him cold. True strength isn't in winning over others, it's in not losing yourself. He stared at it for a long time, fingers trembling slightly. Those words were simple, but they carried everything she had ever tried to show him. For years, he'd fought to prove himself unbreakable. But in doing so, he had broken everything that once made him human. He leaned back, eyes closed, as memories flooded in, her laughter, her steady voice, her quiet defiance. All those moments he dismissed as softness were, in truth, courage. And all the things he once called strength, control, dominance, pride, were just walls built out of fear. The realization came like a tide, gentle yet unstoppable. He wasn't angry anymore, not at her, not even at himself. He just felt tired. tired of pretending that armor was the same as peace. For the first time, he saw her clearly, not as the girl he underestimated, but as the mirror he refused to face. Her absence had been his punishment, but her lesson was his redemption. He closed the notebook carefully, almost reverently. Outside, the rain had stopped, and a faint breeze moved through the open window. Somehow, the silence didn't feel empty this time. It felt like forgiveness. 9. The search for redemption. Adrian didn't know what redemption looked like. He only knew he couldn't stay where he was, in that glass office, surrounded by success that suddenly meant nothing. The walls that once made him feel powerful now felt like reminders of every word he wished he could take back. So, one morning, he left. No meetings, no phone calls, no carefully crafted agenda. Just a man chasing something he had once destroyed. It took weeks to find her. She had moved to a small coastal town, working at a community clinic. When he arrived, the place was quiet, children playing outside, laughter carried by the wind. And there she was. No fancy clothes, no makeup, just sunlight in her hair and the same calm presence that used to unnerve him. He froze for a moment, afraid of what to say. When she noticed him, she didn't look shocked. She just smiled, gently, like she'd already forgiven him long before he came. "I didn't come to ask for anything," he said, voice trembling. "I just needed to tell you that you were right." She studied him for a second, then nodded. "I wasn't trying to be right, Adrian, I was trying to be kind." Her words hit him harder than any rejection. Because in her kindness, there was no pride, no triumph, only peace. And that peace was something he had spent his whole life running from. They talked for a while, about small things, simple things. And when he finally stood to leave, she said softly, "I'm glad you found your way here. But remember, forgiveness isn't something you find in someone else. It's something you learn to give yourself." As he walked away, the ocean wind brushed against his face. For the first time, the weight on his chest began to lift. Redemption, he realized, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to walk forward with honesty, and without the armor. 10. The heart that finally broke. He saw her again one evening, from across the street. The sun was sinking low, painting everything gold, and Evelyn was surrounded by children, their laughter rising into the air like music. She looked happy, effortlessly, genuinely happy. And for a moment, Adrian just stood there, watching her like someone looking at light for the first time after years of darkness. She didn't see him. Maybe she never would again. But that was okay. For the first time, he didn't want to interrupt her peace just to ease his guilt. He didn't need her to forgive him out loud. He had already begun forgiving himself, the hardest kind of forgiveness there is. A child tugged at her sleeve, and she bent down, smiling, her eyes glowing the way they used to when she spoke about hope. That image pierced something in him, not with pain, but with clarity. He finally understood that love was never about possession. It was about presence, and letting go when holding on would only hurt the one you loved. He turned away slowly, the sound of laughter following him down the empty street. And though his chest ached, it wasn't the ache of regret anymore. It was the ache of becoming human again. As the first stars appeared above the ocean, he whispered to himself, "She was never my weakness. She was the part of me I'd forgotten existed." And in that quiet moment, something inside him finally broke, not in despair, but in release. The armor shattered, the walls fell, and for the first time in his life, Adrian Cole felt everything. The sorrow, the beauty, the loss, the love. All of it. And somehow, it was enough. Outro. Some stories don't end with a kiss, or a reunion, or a promise. Some end in silence, the kind that doesn't hurt, but heals. Adrian Cole didn't win Evelyn back. And maybe that was never the point. Because what he found was something rarer, peace within himself. He learned that strength isn't measured by control, or power, or pride. It's measured by how softly you can hold what you love, and how gracefully you can let it go when it's time. In the end, he didn't need her to come back. He just needed to remember what she had awakened, the part of him that could still feel, still care, still love without fear. And that was enough. If you've ever loved someone who changed you, not through grand gestures, but through quiet presence, then maybe this story spoke to a part of you too. Because sometimes, the people who break us aren't cruel. They're mirrors, showing us the cracks we've been too afraid to see. And through those cracks, the light finally gets in. So if this story touched you, take a moment to breathe, and remember that healing doesn't always look like happiness. Sometimes, it simply looks like peace. Tell me in the comments, which part of this story spoke to your heart the most? And if you believe the world needs more stories that heal quietly, please like, share, and subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast. Because here, we don't just tell stories. We remind you that even broken hearts still have something beautiful to give.